Thank you very much, President Falk. I can't tell you how weird it is to have the president of Williams College be my age. I don't know if that makes me like old or you young, but I think probably both. So, I've been thinking a lot in the last few days as I've prepared for this event about my time at Williams, and it was a great time in my life. I loved being there. But I was thinking, of the John Lennon lyric that life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. Well, when I was busy making all of my plans at Williams College, I don't think I ever thought that the Pentagon would happen to me, and that I would spend so much of my career there, or that I would like it as much as I have. Particularly my most recent job, where I was the top energy official at the Department of Defense. And that leads me to what I want to talk to you about today, which is the US military really going green? Now, that may seem like an outlandish question, and you may wonder where it would come from. Well, that's where it comes from. It's been covered quite a bit over the last decade, really, in the press. Everyone from the Wall Street Journal to Mother Jones is telling us that the US military is going green. So, is it true? No, it's not true. Short talk, right? So, no, Angela's telling me I still have 14 minutes left. So the answer is yes also. It is no and yes. And what I'm going to talk to you about now is I'm going to tell you that why the answer is no, why the military is not going green, will never go green, and then I'm going to tell you why it is going green, and I'm going to try to convince you that those contradictory things are actually true. And then I'll finish by explaining how that fits in with global climate change, the greatest challenge of our time. So first, there is nothing environmentally friendly about war. War consumes. This is Antietam in the US Civil War. War destroys. This is Verdun in World War I. This is Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam War. The greatest environmental, this is Palmyra. It's a video, but you get the point, under ISIS. So the greatest environmental policy you could have for the military is not to go to war, is to stay at peace. And I'll tell you that I'm an optimist. I send my own children to a Quaker school, and I really hope they grow up to be men of peace. But I'm also a realist, and war is part of the human condition, and there will always be war. Now, war consumes and war destroys, but war also has tremendous creative capacity. It has been responsible for innovations throughout history, everything from the stirrup to the internet. And that is how we get to yes, that the US military really is going green. So when you think about the military, it's a tremendous enterprise, right? And think of our military. The Department of Defense is a huge business. If you think of it as a business, it has a $700 billion annual budget. That's $500 billion plus the $200 billion it costs to wage war. It has more than 2 million employees and global operations. It's a massive enterprise, and it takes a huge amount of energy to run that enterprise. That makes the Department of Defense the single largest consumer of energy in the country as an institution. If it were a country, it consumes more energy than 2/3 of the nations on Earth. So this is a tremendous amount of energy, and if the Department of Defense taps that innovative power of war when it comes to clean energy to energy, then they could have a tremendous ripple effect across our whole economy. Now, I do want to put that in perspective. Even though it's the single largest consumer, it only accounts for about 2% of total US consumption, and the United States consumes about, if you put it in terms of oil, about 19 million barrels of oil a day. The entire globe consumes 92 million barrels a day. So DoD can do a lot, but the 98% of the rest of the economy has to do its part too if we're going to see a transformation in our energy economy. So I do want to put it in perspective. But now let me tell you a little bit more about how DoD does use energy in two basic ways, one in facilities and one in operations. So facilities energy is very close. It really is like a business when it comes to facilities energy. It's very close to the way that the commercial sector uses energy. It's lights, like these very bright lights shining up there. It's heat, it's air conditioning. And DoD functions like a commercial entity. It gets its power from the commercial grid, and it wants to manage those costs like any other business. It wants to keep them small. When you have a $4 billion annual electricity bill, that's a lot of money that you want to try to save. And of course, it's not really a business, it's a public good, so it also has laws, regulations, executive orders, and internal policies directed at changing the way it uses energy in its facilities. So you'll see lots of efficiency measures, lots of renewable energy targets, energy intensity targets, conservation targets, all kinds of things in that space. And DoD does a lot, and it can do a lot with that kind of scale. It has instruments that are available to it, financing instruments that are unusual. But that $4 billion of electricity only accounts for 1/4 of all the energy the Department of Defense uses. 3/4 is in the operational category, and that was what I was responsible for when I worked there. And that's a $14 billion annual fuel bill. And it is not subject to those laws, regulations, and internal policies because it's so closely tied to warfighting. So you can't put a fuel target on warfighting, because then the next time you need to go somewhere, say North Korea or something like that, wherever the president tells you to go, you're going to blow out your targets. So how do you look at that immense fuel use, and what does it mean on the ground? I'm going to show you what it looks like on the ground. Not this one, we'll skip that one. This one. So for the last 14 years that we've been at war, we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and this is a different kind of war than those pictures I was showing you of the Civil War and the First World War, where we had a front line and we were largely behind our own front line. This is distributed warfare. There is no front line. The war is everywhere, and the adversary is everywhere. And we're a very fuel-hungry military. So that means we have huge convoys of trucks moving through the desert, carrying fuel to our forces. It means we're dropping, that's what that picture in the upper right-hand corner is. Those little black parachutes are carrying fuel. And the soldiers have to go out and get it, go out and find it. We carry by helicopter, drop it by helicopter, and you see below what the challenges are there. Even a foe like the Taliban, which is not the most sophisticated technologically, the most sophisticated adversary you're ever going to see, have improvised explosive devices that can hit a fuel convoy, and they have rocket-propelled grenades that can hit a helicopter. So what was happening in the 2005 timeframe, we finally had leaders in Iraq send back an urgent message to the Pentagon saying, we've got to figure out a way to do this differently. Our convoys are getting hit, and also we're having to put too much combat force protecting them, which means they're not doing other things. So that was where I came in a few years later to look at how we could use energy differently and how we could use different energy to get at this problem. So yes, this was clean energy, but remember, it was for a military purpose. It wasn't just to be environmentally conscious, it was to win the war. So what it looked like was more efficient equipment. That's a generator up at the top. That's a 25% improvement over the equipment they were using. Down below there are shelters. When you put plywood shelters and uninsulated tents out in a place that has ranges from 10 degrees to 120 degrees, you're going to use a lot of fuel keeping them cool and keeping them warm. Those are insulated shelters that are resource efficient, both water and fuel. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that can make a huge difference. Also, that's using energy differently, more efficiently. Also using different energies. So the solar panels, these are hybrid solar generators. For combat outposts that are out in very remote locations, that can make a huge difference because it means they're more self-sufficient. No one has to put their life at risk or be diverted from other missions to bring them their energy, and they can go on and do their missions without worrying about whether the fuel's going to get there or not. And down below is one of my favorites. A friend of mine took this picture, wonderful guy. He took out to this post a solar hybrid generator for their mortar pit. So this mortar had a GPS guidance on it, and that required a battery, and they would have to recharge it either with a generator, which was going through a lot of fuel, making a lot of noise and a lot of fumes, or they'd actually have a car drive up and recharge the battery. And when he first came out there with solar panels, you can bet these soldiers were not all that enthusiastic about solar panels. They said, "You want us to do what?" But when they saw that it was going to give them power 24/7 that had no fumes, no noise, and required no refueling, they liked it a lot. And increasingly, we're seeing this kind of thing happen with the military, where the demand is getting matched up with the energy supply. So security cameras, things like that. So again, this is going green, and this is what it looks like. It's cutting out a lot of fuel use, and it's pushing the pace on renewable energy, but they're doing it for their own reasons. Now, going forward, President Obama has said we need to look to the Asia Pacific. That's a lot of open ocean. It's a long way away. And if we're talking about military forces, it's going to be planes and ships, and they use much, much more fuel than ground troops do, or vehicles. And these are actually refueling operations. You can see that little thin filament that connects the planes and the ships. You might guess that that's kind of vulnerable. And again, it's a really big supply line because these consume a lot of fuel. And we're talking about a future in which any likely adversary is going to have those precision-guided munitions and is going to have drones that can target much more precisely and much more lethally. And so you have a big supply line and precise targeting that's very lethal. So this is a problem that the Department of Defense is looking at how to take care of as we go forward. And again, innovation, this tremendous innovation pool of war comes in with energy as well. It'll be things like retrofitting old equipment. That's a ship there that's had a hybrid electric drive put in. And that's not because we wanted to make a Prius for the military, it's because it can spend more days at sea before it needs to be refueled. And then next to that is a DARPA project, which is a solar unmanned system, a solar drone. It can stay up now. Okay, the Department of Defense might like solar power. I'm sure they do. And I know we have someone in the audience who loves solar power, so we did too. However, that's not why we like this so much. Why we like this is because it can stay up for a really long time. It makes no noise. It has no heat signature. It gives you a capability that you want, and that has a really strong pull. Robotic vehicles, and then also sometimes the innovation isn't going to be specifically energy. It might be nanotechnology that profoundly changes the way you use energy. So what does that mean for climate change? It's the same kind of thing. It's about defense as a business and the business of defense. For defense as a business, the Department of Defense has that scale we were talking about. It's an enormous landowner, 28 million acres, 500,000 structures, all over the world. A lot of them are coastal, a lot of them are arid, and the department has already taken steps to adapt to climate change in those places because they have to, right? So it's things like building codes. You can't build on a military reservation right now unless you account for climate change. But then there's the business of defense itself, and that's about the mission. Humanitarian and disaster relief, something like 40,000 defense personnel were involved in Sandy and in the relief there. Typhoon Haiyan. This is a core mission for the department. They need to understand how it's changing. The Arctic as it melts becomes, as a Navy officer told me once, not good news, of course, but also an entirely new ocean to patrol. That means search and rescue missions. It means Russia. And Russia's taking some very aggressive steps in the Arctic. So the department needs to figure out what that looks like. And then finally, the department's core strategy document called the Quadrennial Defense Review referred to climate change as a threat accelerator. So what does that mean? Well, it's not a threat, a military threat. You're not going to go attack it and try to kill climate change, although that would be nice, wouldn't it, Mark? It affects every other problem. So if you have a weak government that now suddenly has to deal with drought or with extreme weather, you're going to see refugee movements, you're going to see conflict. And the Department of Defense needs to understand what that looks like so it can plan for the future and how to keep this country safe and our allies safe. And just a quote, Admiral Sam Locklear, who's the former commander of Pacific Command, when he looked out at the Asia Pacific, said, it's climate change that's the greatest long-term threat to the region. So that's how the department looks at these issues. It's fundamentally a civil society challenge and an economic challenge, but it's going to affect the defense mission, and the department needs to figure out what that looks like. So to go full circle, I wanted to go back to those terrible pictures of war. Well, these are the same places. Antietam, Verdun, Ho Chi Minh City, and Palmyra, now that it's been taken back, well, remains to be seen. It turns out that maybe the damage wasn't as bad as we thought. So the bottom line is the Earth is resilient, and the Earth can recover. The Earth will be fine. But the question is, will people, and will humanity? And that's up to us. And I hope what your major takeaway is from this talk is that when we have a priority, a human endeavor as urgent and compelling as war, we can be very ingenious in how we solve it and how we address it. And I hope that we bring the same kind of ingenuity to the greatest challenge of our time, which is climate change. So thank you very much.